Hi, I'm Colin Johnson, and I'm getting to sit down here today with Remington Holt. He is a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, and he's actually one of my greatest friends. So, super love having you here. Remington, let's just start off talking about your work. What is your work? What do you do?
So I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant for schools. And a lot of people are like, oh, well, what does that mean? And if you say for schools, do you only do schools? No, it means that, I'm teaching schools because that's where I come from. I am a lifelong educator. I come from a long family lineage of educators. So that's my wheelhouse. And so I'm teaching people how not to be racist in schools through, systems. Like, what do we need to change about the system of school? What do we need to change about the way we're approaching education to promote equity for everybody?
Yeah. Also, it's a really powerful career choice, first of all. So I honor you in that.
Right.
How did you get there, though? It's also very specific. Like, what in your life brought you to the point where you're saying, this is what I want to do, this is what I feel called to do? How did you get here?
Woo, that's a long story. I grew up in West Tennessee. Like, I'm from the country. I always think I don't have a Southern accent until somebody from somewhere else hears me, and I'm just like, man, shut up. I talk regular. Be quiet. Coming from the South, growing up in the country, I was raised by my great grandmother. As I'm starting to do this work more, I'm recognizing how I was so set up for this from the beginning. And so, we're being raised by my great grandmother, who was 69 when I was born. And so, wow, just being born into such a rich history and being able to sit with her for 18 years of my life and 21 years if you count going back home during college and stuff. She talked to me about so many different stories about stuff that happened to her. Like, I remember when I found out that she had to drop out of school in the 8th grade to pick cotton. And a lot of people think, oh, black people ain't picked cotton since whatever the book said. No, my mother is the first person in my family who did not pick cotton when she was little. Wow. And so, so thinking about that, also my mom had me when she was pregnant with me when she was 18. She was a senior in high school. And so, all of my life she has been in college. And so I was raised by my great grandmother. And so going to these schools out in the country, I remember I've always been a scholastic person. I love academics. I love school. I always have since I was little. And so I remember about in the 5th grade, I think is what it was. So I lived out in the country, and now that I think back, I think my school might have been majority black. My elementary school might have been half black, half white, but it might have been majority black. But the way it worked was a lot of the black kids from the inner city were bused to this school out in the country. And so when I've been going to school with these kids for 5 years, since kindergarten, but I recognized we were never all in the same place at the same time. And so now I'm able to look back and see there was tracking or, whatever the equivalent of the honors class or the high academics or whatever it would have been. And there just weren't a lot of black people in my class. Yeah. But also being a teacher's pet kind of person. The teachers always be like, Remington, will you run this to the office? Will you take this here? Will you do this there? And every time I went into the hallway, there was a black kid who was just sitting on the floor outside of a classroom. And so I remember after, first few times I didn't say anything, but then I remember I want to know how this keeps happening, because it was just not a part of my school experience. I never got sent out of class. And so every time I would be out there, I start stopping by and being like, what happened? And the person would tell me so the teacher said this and da 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 da, and then she made me get out. And I don't remember what my response was, but I would stop at every kid who was put out of class and just ask them what happened. And I don't know, that just stuck with me. Yeah. And so once I saw that it was always the same kids over and over, and that they were always black, and I'm just so that was like one of the first things that I remember in elementary school. And then I remember when I went into middle school, I don't know, I became a lot more vocal about it. Like, you know, I tried to make a conscious effort to connect with Black kids who were at my school, even though we weren't in the same classes, like it became more and more stratified in middle school. Yeah. And I just remember feeling like I had this like up and down relationship with the black kids. It didn't matter. And this started in elementary school. You know, like, these kids were rough and tumble. They were coming from the housing projects, and a lot of times they were bullying folks and fighting with people. But it got to the point where they'd be like, no, don't touch Remington. He's cool. And like, it didn't, you know, and of course I was nerdy. My glasses was thicker than a Snicker, boy. Like, and I was walking around and like, you know, but they're like, don't mess with him. He's cool. And so, you know, I don't know. It's just like, so that connecting to that experience, and I didn't realize at the time it was called marginalization, that they were being marginalized in a way, but I was just, I don't know, I just remember having a lot of empathy for them of like, why don't they get to have fun at school like I get to have fun at school? Why don't they like it? Why aren't they succeeding? And so that's kind of where it started. If we fast forward into college and all that, I hated my undergrad, and at the time, like my undergrad is in elementary education, my master's is in special education, and so I used to be a classroom teacher. My undergrad program at the time that I got into it was ranked the #1 education program in the world. And they, like, I still to this day say that program was just about teaching privileged white kids who are still, like, who are gonna go to college whether you teach them or not. And so speaking of that rebellious streak, doing things a little different, once I got about 2 years into undergrad, I was like, oh, so they really not gonna talk about black folks. Like, they're really just gonna act like you walk in the classroom and you say, all right, Jimmy, sit down, and then we just start teaching. I was like, that wasn't my experience in school. People be fighting and all kind of stuff going on. And so I remember I took my classroom management class, and they was like, so you come in day one and you want to set your procedures. And I remember I raised my hand. I asked the professor, what do you do when somebody pull out a knife? And he just didn't have an answer. And so I'm like, you know, in my mind, I'm just like, okay, well. And so from that point on, I would just start, I don't know, maybe my professors, they might have hated me. I would just start challenging stuff. They bring in whatever the latest research was in this article and that article, and they'd be like, so does anyone have any thought-provoking questions? And I would always ask something super black, and they just did not have any response. And so I internalized that, oh, so you can be the #1 education school in the country and still don't have nothing for black folks, and nobody has any questions for you. Nobody. And so I just knew at that point I had to do something that was going to be different. I taught for about a collective 8 years across that time. But once I got in the classroom and saw the same things that I saw in elementary school still happening when I'm teaching in a school, I'm like, okay, so that means the teacher can't fix it. It's got to be something else. And so that's why I started my own business and became, you know, a consultant.
Awesome. For sure. So we're going to get talking into kind of more about what your work specifically looks like. But I think a good place to start for us talking about your work is going over your view generally of just the differences between white culture and black culture, and kind of where that begins your work as like the foundation.
So a part of the work that I do, like a part of my structure for my organization and my consulting, is that I only operate in 3 to 5 year contracts. So like, you cannot book me for a one-off training. You cannot book me for a little, oh, we're having some issues with our black boys in the 8th grade, and we would like you to come in and motivate them to do what we want them to do. No, I don't do that. What my work looks like is we start from the ground up. First year, if we're talking about a standard 3-year contract, first year, the first question that has to be on the table is, what is whiteness? Because like you think about my target demographic is white people. And because that's where I've been. Even when I was in elementary school, most of my teachers were white, like, and I saw how they treated the black kids. I saw how they treated me differently because I was one of the good ones. So when I look back and take all of my data about racism and discrimination, it starts with this concept of whiteness. And so in year one, we're going to be tackling for first the leadership team of your school or your organization. What is whiteness? Because white people don't have to think about their race. And I think one of the most dangerous things about racism and just being the majority anywhere is that you just have the right to get stagnant. It's just easy because you're like, well, this is how things always go for me, so this is what it is. And so usually in year one of what that works looks like, I'm teaching people what is the difference between these cultures. What does culture mean? What is racism? What is anti-racist? Like, what are these terminologies? Where did it come from? What does it look like in my daily life? And usually, that kind of stirs the pot, and it gets people uncomfortable. It gets people out of their little walking day by day. One of the schools that I worked with recently, after I did that first presentation, every time I came to the school, they would email me like, I was at lunch today and I saw that whiteness that you were talking about. Like, I never thought about it like that before. And so it stirs them out of their norm. Then year two, we harness that stirring, that new understanding for a lot of white people that, everything I do is not the only way to do it. Everything that I do is not just normal or unquestioned. So I will usually say, all right, school leaders, with what was impactful to you last year, and like if we were thinking about training the next set of leaders, the next set of folks in your school, who would you want to go next? What do they need to hear? And how does it need to work out? Like, how does it need to show up in the work that we do? And so a lot of times they're like, well, I want kind of our lead teachers, or like even just like the full teaching staff needs to understand this next, because now the leaders have had a year of shifting their lens. So what I've seen is, like, once we go through that first training year with the leadership, they start to get uncomfortable watching the product that they built before they knew about whiteness. And they're like, man, I didn't ever notice our teachers were doing this. I never noticed that our teachers were doing that. I think now we need to train the teachers. And so it becomes this, like waterfall effect. And then once the teachers start to see it, like, then the second year, the teachers were like, I never knew that this thing I was doing in my class was coming through the lens of whiteness or whatever. Like, and I just never thought about it like that before. And, and that stirs the kids a little bit. And so, of course, year three, now we got everybody working and moving. The leadership has the ability to talk about this new vision that we're casting, where whiteness does not run everything, where whiteness is not the norm. The teachers are getting on board. I'm not going to say they're on board. There's some things we'll talk about later on that prevent some pitfalls, some difficulties, some opportunities for growth. But then, but generally, second year, teachers are kind of mobilizing and they're like, I want to do something different. Third year, we got everybody shaking and moving, got the kids doing projects and everything. And so that's like typically what a cycle of my work looks like.